So my interest in the glyphosate case, in a way, began decades before the glyphosate case began. And that's one of the ways in which I think that my field, science and technology studies, can help to make sense of the sort of impasse almost that we see in this very complicated controversy, largely in the European Union, but with ramifications throughout the world. So STS as a field wants to tell stories in the social sciences that do not take things for granted. I mean, that is, if there's one sort of normative commitment in STS, it is if other people take it for granted, you should ask why it is that they came to take it for granted. So in the glyphosate controversy, there are battle lines drawn of all kinds, but they center on who is getting the science right. And this is, from the STS point of view, too far downstream a question. Of course it's important to ask who's getting the science right, but it's equally important to ask, how did they come to any conclusions about rightness and wrongness in the first place? This is a chemical. It's been in widespread use. It's been considered to be safe for many, many years. This is what accounts for the market share that it has today. So it is an oddity in the first place that it should have been around dominating the market for so long, spawning a secondary industry that is so important. GMOs, the whole Roundup Ready crop line that Monsanto developed would not have existed without a foundation of glyphosate. So it is, how do you explain that puzzle? Why is it that people came to accept something and now they don't accept it, or at least are worried about it? And I think the STS perspective allows us to pick apart different pieces of it. So in my talk, I'm going to pick apart certain pieces that lend themselves to study. One is the question of advisory committees. So it's not the case that science just exists out there in the peer-reviewed literature and you take it off the shelf and you apply it and you get a regulatory decision. Most of these processes are mediated by expert advisory committees. They have their own dynamics. They come from different places. They often subscribe to the same principles and yet reach different conclusions, even though they're reading the same basic scientific literature. So what is it about the dynamics of these advisory committees and how they interact with policy on the one side and science on the other side, and come to these different conclusions? So this is one dimension that I want to pick apart. But it's also a finding of STS over many, many years that when you have a long-standing, long-running controversy, one that refuses to resolve itself, you should look wider than the scientific debates. You can talk till you're blue in the face about, were the preconditions for this animal study right? And did that epidemiological study use the right controls or not? And those are important technical debates. But people get much more worried about technical debates if they have other concerns. And those concerns can include many things, such as in many societies, the continuing fear of cancer as a disease that refuses to yield to therapeutic interventions. So shouldn't we try to understand our environment better to see what is going on in it that might be inducing kinds of cancer we don't understand otherwise? People are very worried about those sorts of things. People are worried about market domination that causes an innovation in the West to spread unchecked and to dominate things like the seed supply or the food supply in other countries. This has nothing to do with the quality of the science in the first place, although the quality of the science then becomes important if the scientific argument is holding up a social order in which people are suffering needlessly because of overuse of pesticides. There are resistant strains proliferating through the world. I mean, these days, if you ask any public health expert what are the things you worry about, one of them that comes up all the time is antimicrobial resistance. But let's not forget that antimicrobial resistance is the knock-on effect of one of these things that we consider to be a miracle of modernity, that we have things that get rid of microbes and keep us from having diseases. We're living longer, eating healthier, supposedly. And yet now people are fearing that there's this catastrophic thing waiting in the wings, that in just maybe 10 years we will have no antibacterial medications that are going to help us out. So those are these sort of wider socioeconomic, sociopolitical consequences that come about because people's foundational commitments are not being addressed. And even we as scholars tend to fall into the intellectually interesting trap of trying to decide who's right and who's wrong in an epistemic sense, instead of asking what is an equally important question: why do the epistemics matter? Why is it important to get this right or wrong? And it's in asking that double-barreled question that I think STS, on the one hand, makes its own specific contributions known, and on the other hand, speaks at the same time to the two big constituencies in this workshop today: the law side, which is interested in the should, ought, normative questions, and the science side, which is interested in the are we getting it at least reasonably right or not.